Shalom, shalom, Israel, shalom, shalom, brothers Abdallah.
Brother Knockoff.
Khan coming back at you with another W5 history cold cut, going into diverse history topics, going into a lot of different history through the spirit. Last week we touched on Jim Crow laws, right, in the 100-year period history behind the so-called abolishment of slavery. But this week we dated him all the way back to Egypt, man, all the way back into the first captivity, starting off when Joseph, was ruling, who was the kings during that time, right? How did that fare? Well, what happened? Linking it up with the scriptures. All right, shalom, shalom. All right, to those on the comment board, right, all the way until the 19th dynasty, right, where you had the 12 tribes of Israel, who was the kings ruling during that time. Man. So a lot of history that we can go into, a lot of history that we're going back to through the spirit, just to kind of edify our people and kind of help paint the picture when we're going into the scriptures. Right? You want to know these kings that lived, you want to know the history behind it. It was very important and imperative. All right, let me pull up a precept real quick. All right, let me get a precept real quick. All right, you can go to the book of Job, right, chapter 8. Actually, here. All right, it's the book of Job, chapter 8, and verse number 8. See what it says. Lord have mercy. Job 8 and 8. There we go. All right, it's Job chapter 8 and 8. For I inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of thy father. So the Lord said, for inquire. What does it mean to inquire? To ask, right? To look at, to search, right? Really, it just means to search when you inquire something, right? Of the former age. What is the former age, right? The ages that was before us, man. Our ancestors, right? The kingdoms that ruled before us, because our ancestors lived in these different kingdoms, and we want to know who the king. We know who the American king is. We know all the presidents in Babylon, but there were presidents and there was kings and pharaohs in different time periods as well that lived during the times of our fathers that we want to dive into, right? And it says, "Prepare thyself to the search of thy father." So we have to search out our fathers, search out the history, and search out the things that went on during that time, huh? Right? Let me read this in NLT. It says, just as the previous generation, pay attention to the experience of our ancestors. It's me right there. We have to pay attention to the experience of our ancestors. What did Job experience? Who did he experience it with? Not Job, Joseph. Who did he experience it with? What about Jacob? What about the 12 tribes? Right? What you got it, King?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's important to go back into history. And, make sure you're going into as many things as possible. Especially if you're on the highways and byways, you never know certain questions that come up. If you win this thing, people ask you questions. You always got to be ready to give an answer to every man that asks you. So let's go to Sirach chapter 5, verse 15. The Most High said, "Don't be ignorant in anything in a great matter nor small." So whatever things you can find out that benefit the ministry, that benefit, knowledge increasing, you want to search that out. And not only do you want to search that out, but you want to search it out so you can give it freely to your people. Because again, you never know what type of questions could be asked. And not only that, but it's good when it comes to defending the faith, defending the doctrine. Because you already know these things through the research and the studying and the work that you've been putting in. So it's the book of Sirach, chapter 5, and verse number 15. It says, "Be not ignorant of anything in a great matter or small." Yeah, no brother or sister could say, "Oh, that was just so long ago. There's no point of going into it." Or you can't be going into history or reading the Bible and you're not trying to find everything out. The Most High said, "Don't be ignorant in a great matter or in a small matter." So in every matter, you should try to acquire some type of information or knowledge. Now let's go to Sirach 33 and verse 17, real quick. But that's what I want. Sirach 33 and verse number 17. Right? It says, "Consider that I labor not for myself only, but for all them that seek learning." And that's the point. You're going into this deep dark history, right? And it's not for yourself. All right, it's just not so you can have all the knowledge and all the understanding that you know everything, but it's really for the learner. All right, for the brothers and sisters that got these questions. So I'm gonna read that again. Consider that I labor not for myself only, but for all of them that seek learning. So we find these things out, and we're giving it out freely, not for ourselves only, but for everyone. You know, because again, this is good information, good history that we can go into, and see the state of our people during the times of Egypt and captivity. Because these things you're not gonna learn in school. No, America's not gonna go into Egypt's history of Joseph, Jacob, Moses. That's something that we got to do on our own and acquire of our own knowledge through what? Through searching and acquiring, like how the brother brought out. I got one more precept. Let's go to First Chronicles, chapter 25, and verse number 8. All right, let's go to First Chronicles, chapter 25, and verse number 8. All right, and it says, "And they cast lots, ward against ward, right? As well the small as the great, the teacher as the scholar." So even in the ancient world, during the time of Chronicles, during the time of the kings, the Most High said we had scholars, we had teachers. And that spirit of being a scholar now was just pushed as, okay, you got to have a PhD, you got to be a doctor to have to be considered a scholar. You got to go through this many years of schooling. Well, the real scholars, according to the Bible, are God's chosen people. All right, we're the ones that have all the history accounts. You read about Josephus. All right, you read about different scribes and different men in the Bible that had wise counsel that was good in history. So the original scholars really go back to the Black and Hispanics, right? God's chosen people. So when God said the teacher as the scholar, you should apply to be that scholar that the Most High has set our fathers up to be and has set us up to be. Through much studying, learning, research, history, laboring, you should try to get in that spirit of being a teacher and being a scholar so you can, again, teach your people and let them know these things, because America's not going to do it. The church is not going to do it. The society, they're not going to teach you, give you breakdowns and give you back your history. America, they're not going past 1619. They're telling you that you was in slavery, teach you Rosa Parks, damn Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey. That's it. They're not going to tell you about Joseph, Moses. They're not going to tell you about the state of our fathers and the rulership that we have. So that's when the scholarship come in on our end, because again, that's all we got, through the spirit and power of the Most High. All right, but you got it.
Con, yeah, I mean, we have to be the scholars. We have to be all things, man. We have to abound in all things. We go to the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 4. We start at verse 6. Right? Okay, this is going to go to, we start at verse, it's actually 2 Timothy. That's what I want. 2 Timothy, chapter 4, and verse number, let me see what I want. Verse 5. But watch thou in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, and make full proof of thy ministry. So the Lord told us to make full proof of our ministry. This is part of making full proof of our ministry, man. Right? It's going, like you said, it's going into the history and kind of linking up certain things that are, about our fathers that we read in the Bible, so we can help paint an accurate picture when you're reading the scriptures, man. So the pharaohs that lived during that time, right? What was going on, the time period, what it was like, the setting, the who, the what, the audience, right? And you'll be able to teach the scriptures a lot more eloquently to your people to help it make more sense to them, man. Because some of our people, they never heard this information before. But the better, we go into it, the more we teach it, the more we understand it, it can help fare well for our people. That's why the Lord said, make full proof of thy ministry. And this is part of making full proof of your ministry, man. Right? So we can hop into it through the Spirit. All right? We can hop into it through the Spirit. So I kind of...
I had to work too. And also, when you read the precepts, you read about Stephen. Stephen was able to recount all the accounts of our fathers just off the top of his head. When you read Acts the 7th chapter. All right, I'm gonna read this real quick. You ain't gotta put it up. Well, you can, but I'm gonna read this real quick. This Acts chapter 7 and verse number Uh, let me see what I want. This whole thing is kind of fire. Right, it's the book of Acts, chapter 7, and verse number. I'm gonna start at verse 14. Right, I'm gonna start at verse 14. It says, well, Acts 6 and 14. Right, it says, "For we have heard him say that this Yahweh Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us. All that sat in the council, looking steadfastly on him, saw his face as it had been the face of an angel." And we read the next chapter, really the whole chapter, right? Joseph was able to recall all the accounts of the spirit. You even had Achior the Ammonite in Judges the 5th chapter, a heathen. He was recounting all the precepts, all the accounts, right, of our forefathers. So you can't let these other nations, outshine what you got going on. They know more about your history more than you. We had an Edomite at camp yesterday. He was coming up, he was trying to avoid the questions and kind of was going on a long rant. He had that Achior spirit. He tried to go from pulling up accounts from Egypt all the way into the time of Christ. And that's the first thing that kind of came to my head, because Jake, that's just walking past, they don't know this stuff. But Esau, he think he a Bible scholar trying to record all these things off the top of his head. So you can't let these nations know more about history than yourself. But you got it.
So we're going to dive into this history, going into Joseph, because a lot of different scholars, when you kind of do this research, are conflicted with time periods that Joseph lived, the ruler that lived during the Pharaoh that lived during the time of Moses, and was this the Pharaoh that lived, and dates and things like that. So we have to kind of dive into it to kind of get a better understanding of when our people live, right? So this is BibleArchaeology.org, right? Kind of going to Joseph in Egypt. Right. So Joseph lived during the time of the Middle Kingdom. Right. Joseph lived during the time of the Middle Kingdom from 1897 BC to around 1878 BC. And it's going to kind of go into it, right, about the Middle Kingdom a little bit. Right. And it says the Middle Kingdom was one of the Egypt's 3 greatest ages. Right. High as 1964. Right. These are the sources. The country was unified and prosperous and was in a process of conquering Nubia, right, which is Ethiopia, located in what is today the Sudan. In the Bible, this area is called Ethiopia. Right. This is also known as the 18th dynasty. Right. This is also known as the 18th dynasty. Right. Let me kind of scroll down a little bit.
We might have to zoom in a little bit too. The word's kind of hard to read.
All right, there we go. You see it now?
All
right. So the Hyksos period is the second intermediate period, right? That's right after the Middle Kingdom. And the Hyksos goes into the word Asiatic. Those are everybody from Syria on east from Egypt. And they refer to the Israelites as Hyksos people because we weren't from Egypt or from that area. We were actually from over there, which we'll call, Syria, right? Or the Levant, or where Israel is, right? And it says, another misconception about the Hyksos concerns their name. Josephus, an Israelite historian writing in the 1st century AD during the days of the great Israelite revolt against the Roman Empire, Roman armies led by Vespasian, said that the term Hyksos meant shepherd kings. Because who are the shepherds? We're the shepherds. Right? A lot of our forefathers, King David, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were shepherds. Right. So they named that on us. Right. And this is, of course, quite wrong. Right. The name Hyksos comes from 2 Egyptian words meaning ruler of foreign lands. It has nothing to do with the shepherds. The final incorrect idea regarding the Hyksos is that they ruled all of Egypt. They did not, because we didn't rule Egypt. We were just in there for slavery. They only controlled the Delta region, at least for any length of time. Right. During which of these 2 periods of the time did Joseph come to Egypt as a slave? Right. So it's either going to be the second intermediate period or the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdoms where Egypt was most prosperous. And you're going to find out it's the Middle Kingdom, right? It has become fashionable among scholars to date him with the Hyksos period, since it's generally assumed that the Israelites were fellow Asiatics related to the Hyksos, right? Because they considered us to be Hyksos people, Asiatics, right? And this is what they would assume, right? It assumed since Joseph eventually rose up to a high position in the Egyptian court, the king must have been a fellow countryman of Joseph's. If we allow for a sojourn of some 400 years in Egypt by the Israelites, And if we accept the so-called late date of the Exodus in the middle of 1200 BC, a date for Joseph around 16 BC, 1650 BC would be perfect. But that would be incorrect, and they're going to tell you why. Right? It says the scriptures, on the other hand, provides us with some specific chronological data regarding these events. When you read First Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, it kind of tells you that, around 480 years before Solomon's, when the children of Israel was coming out of Egypt. So scholars use that to kind of pinpoint the date. They know Solomon lived around the time of 940 BC, right after the reign of David, right, or around 966. So they'll place the Exodus around 446. If 430 years before this, that would be around 1876. I'm kind of just summing it up, right? So around this time. So if Joseph lived around this time, it would say these biblical references clearly show that Joseph ought to be dated in the Middle Kingdom rather than the second intermediate period or the Hyksos period, right? And it says several specific points in the Joseph story confirms the Middle Kingdom rather than the Hyksos date for Joseph in Genesis 41 and 14, right? And they kind of name a couple of scriptures to kind of show that. Let me jump down a little bit, kind of sum it up a little bit. All right, here we go. And it says, now, if Joseph was being rewarded by Hyksos king, it stands to reason that his new wife would not have been the daughter of the priest of Re, but rather the daughter of the priest of Set. Once again, the Middle Kingdom seems a better choice for dating Joseph rather than second intermediate period. Thus, relying on the biblical chronology and his new historical material, we will place Joseph in the Middle Kingdom period under two great rulers. Now, who are these rulers? Right? Who are these rulers that ruled during the time of Joseph? Who is the Pharaoh that lived during the time of Joseph? So when Joseph was coming into Egypt, right? Let me actually pull that up. All right, I'm going to Genesis chapter 37. Right? This is Genesis chapter 37. And I'm going to start at verse number 24. So this is the time that Joseph was being sold into Egypt. Right? This is the time that Joseph was being sold into Egypt. And it says, and they took him and cast him to a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? All right, come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. And his brethren were content. Then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew up and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So when Joseph was going into Egypt, who was the king or who was the Pharaoh that was ruling during this time? So when you go back to it, you will find out that was Setchachus II. He reigned from 1897 to 1878 BC, right? 1897 to 1878 BC. And they said Joseph got there around this time as well, around the end of the reign of Setchachus II, when you go into it. And then who is the king that was ruling when Joseph was growing up? Setchachus III, 1878 to 1843 BC, right? So this is the king that was ruling during the time when Joseph was Pharaoh. Joseph was second under Pharaoh. Let me get that real quick. Go to Genesis chapter 45. Verse 1. All right, this is Genesis chapter 45, and I'm gonna start at verse. Actually, go to Genesis. Yeah, Genesis 45, and start right here. And it says, then Joseph could not refrain himself from before all them that stood by him, and he cried, because every man to go out from me, and there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph, doeth my father that yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. So when he was in the house of Pharaoh, he set them Egyptians out. Who was the Pharaoh that was reigning during this time? Right? Years and years and years later. That was Setchachus III, 1878 to 1843 BC. That was this Pharaoh that reigned, right? The last king of the 18th dynasty. And it says Joseph entered Egypt as a slave. It is interesting to note that slavery was not a very old concept in Egypt. It had not existed earlier in the Old Kingdom, but the period when the Great Pyramids were built, those structures were not, as it stated, sometimes built by late slave labor. They were constructed by draft peasant labor. The Middle Kingdom is the first major period in Egyptian history where slavery was well known. In the 1950s AD, the American Egyptologist William C. Hayes published a famous papyrus document from the Middle Kingdom, which had a list of slaves on one side and a discussion of Egyptian prisons on the other. The next issue of Bible and Spade will examine this information, right, yada, yada, yada. Right? So this kind of outlines the kings that lived during the time of Egypt, kind of painting the two specific time periods, right? So the time periods that they is most important is the second intermediate period is the Hyksos period, which we talked about, and what the Middle Kingdom, in the Middle Kingdom is where they lived during the time of Joseph, right? Right, the second intermediate period or the Hyksos period, right? Because they called us Asiatics. Did you have any points or precepts you want to bring out on this, King?
No, you kind of.
Let me kind of get a precept real quick. I'm going to go to Psalms chapter 105, verse number 18. All right, talking about Joseph, right? Psalms 105 and 18. I start at verse 17. And it says, he sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters, who he was laid in iron. Right? They put Joseph in prison, right? For false charges. And it says, until the time that his word came, the word of the Lord tried him. The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. We read that was Sennacherib III. He made him lord of all his house and ruler of all his substance, to bind his princes at his pleasure and to teach his senators wisdom. Because when you go into this, right, when you go into this time period with Joseph, that was the most prosperous time period, right, for the Egyptian captivity, man. I mean, for the Egyptian empire, which is the Middle Kingdom. And how did that work out? Why? Because you had a Hebrew that was really ruling during this time. Because Joseph helped put an end to that famine, man, for 7 years and sustained the people through much wisdom. And the Lord tells you that because it says, and he taught his senators wisdom, his officers, his judges, all of that came from Joseph. Joseph was the wisest man there. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And he increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people and to deal subtly with his servants. And this is during the time, we can get next is right after Joseph, right? Right after Joseph, that king that knew not Pharaoh was a different king, right? And that's kind of going into. But you got it, King. You can pull up your article if you want.
You can pull up the first one that's on the
I pulled up 3. I just put up a random 3. Hold on.
Okay, Khan. Yeah, you can go there.
This one.
No, you go to the did you get the Harvard one with the pictures? I believe that's it.
Yes.
Yeah, Khan. All right, you can scroll down. Baba Kasha. Around about the 4th or 5th paragraph.
Right here.
All right. Let me see. That's about the 4th, 5th paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay, Khan. Yeah, go down to about a picture right there.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, right there. That's cool. It says the circumstances of Jacob group's exodus from Egypt are recounted in many documents, most notable by Matthew. So we read about this man, right? Matthew. He was a scholar during the time of the so-called Romans. All right, the Greeks. Some say Romans, some say Greeks. But Josephus, he kind of went through his work, And this man, what he did was he was an Egyptian, or he was a Greco-Egyptian. He was in the Grecian captivity or understanding a Hellenist. And that also proves that it was Hellenists, other nations as well, right? Through the conquest of Alexander and all these generals that he had. Nevertheless, this man, he was a Grecian, or he was an Ethiopian priest slash scholar. So it says an Ethiopian priest writing during the Second Temple period around the 3rd century BCE. His writings are preserved in the work of the Judean historian Josephus Flavius, who lived in the 1st century CE. It says, according to Matthew, a group called the Hyksos, right, what the brother just went into, the Hyksos, quote unquote, Asiatic people, or people from the east. It says came from Canaan, right, overran Egypt, were driven out, went back to Canaan, and ultimately settled later in Jerusalem. So we read these, accounts like this. It's not gonna say Israelites all the time. It's not gonna say, I don't know if we could say that, the word, Jeew, but I'm gonna say Judean. Judean people, Israelite people. So you gotta kind of dissect. You kind of gotta go off the details on what's written. All right, because the Bible, of course, is gonna make it plain on what's going on. But other nations, from their point of view, they have different names labeled for certain nations. They have different titles and proverbs and bywords for certain people. It's not always going to say God's chosen people, Black, Hispanic, and Native American, so-called. So you got to kind of line up and see what's going on and match it up with the precepts. So you had the Hyksos people, right, that came from Canaan, right? It says overran Egypt. Now, I want to get this quick precept because it said they came from Canaan. Let's go to Genesis chapter, what's that, 28. Let's go to Genesis 28 and verse, right, Genesis 28, because Jacob, he sojourned in the land of Canaan. Right, let's go to Genesis 28 and verse number, I'm gonna start at verse 18. All right, Genesis 28 and verse 18. It says, and Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. So this location where it's Bethel, this is within the land of Israel. If you look up a map of Israel in the intro, Bethel, it was one of the chief cities of Ephraim. I should read that in 1 Kings. I should read that in the book of 1 Kings as well. When they went off, they set up idols in Bethel, idols in Dan. So Jacob, he actually sojourned in the land of Canaan at this time. So you can go back to the article real quick. So what it's talking about, this people that came from Canaan, right, which is another name for Israel, right? The original name before it was called Israel, said they came from Canaan. Jacob and his sons, they came and they migrated from Canaan to Egypt because of the famine. It says, came from Canaan, it says overran Egypt. Now, let's go to the book of Exodus, chapter 1. So we know when we got to Egypt, we was overpopulated. All right, so much to where the Pharaoh had to conspire against us and put us in slavery. So certain counts that you read about through history, they may be more in depth in the Bible. The Bible, you may have to read through the lines. It's not going to paint out everything in a detailed form, but that's what these other nations, that's what they scribed down. They got their, respective accounts as well. You got to kind of line these things up and make it match and fit like a puzzle. So this Exodus chapter 1 and verse number 7. All right, picking up on what a brother left off at Exodus 1 and 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the lands was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. And that lets you know that in Egypt, we was kind of running things. We was, doing this, and we was doing that. We was kind of excelling over the Egyptians, which is why this Pharaoh, he seen that he had to kind of so-called quote unquote check us. Why? Because we was doing so much work. You can't just read this, read straight through it, and not kind of read in between the lines and see the reasoning for that. We have to have been doing so much work and just exceedingly mighty and just doing things. He had to kind of put us in captivity. So that's why when we read that article, you can go back to it real quick. That's all I got on there. That's why when you read the article, it says, right, we're driven out, right, went back to Canaan and multiplied, so and ultimately settled later in Jerusalem. Now we'll be here all day if we just went through, the whole account of Exodus and all the numbers, Deuteronomy, and the 40 years. Nevertheless, if you got time, read that. From the time of Egypt till we left out of Egypt, from Exodus all the way to Deuteronomy to Joshua and all these accounts. So let's read on. It says later, the Pharaoh named Salakia, right? Later, the Pharaoh named Ahmose, who wanted to come face to face with the gods, was told by his counselors that only if Egypt was cleansed of lepers, he would be able to see the gods. It says Ahmose collected all the lepers in Egypt together and settled them in a remote city, Aravis, which had previously been the Hyksos capital. It says the lepers rebelled against Ahmose and appointed a leper priest called Osarphius as their leader. Now you gotta kind of pay attention to these names and these details, right? Osarphius, who was the leader over these quote unquote lepers, these quote unquote unclean people. And remember, he's writing from the standpoint of an Egyptian. So that's how he refers to this certain group of people. It says Osarphius had previously served at the temple of the sun god on the biblical on and Heliopolis, and he gave the lepers a new religion that was hostile to the Egyptian religion. They despised the Egyptian gods and sacred animals, which they slaughtered, roasted, and ate. So this certain man, this would be Moses, who they're referring to. Now, was Moses serving, gods and ancient gods? No, he wasn't. But again, from their perspective, this is how they kind of write it, how they kind of, scribed it out from their end. They're heathens. So, they kind of got it all jammed up. Nevertheless, that's why it's important to pay attention and read in between the lines, chew the meat and spit out the bones. So that last part, it said they despised the Egyptian gods, right? Because when Moses came back, he taught us who? The God of Israel. He didn't teach us the ways of the Egyptians. He told Pharaoh, let my people go. He told him, come out of Egypt. So it said they despised the Egyptian gods and sacred animals. It says, which they slaughtered, roasted, and ate. All right. And that's kind of similar to Passover. Slaughtered a lamb, you roasted, right, and ate. That's what we did in Egypt. The first Passover was kept in Egypt. So again, you want to kind of line these things up, kind of make it fit, right? And another point too, when you read up a little bit, it says, he gave the lepers a new religion that was hostile to the Egyptian religion, right? Because when Moses went up to Pharaoh, he said, "Let my people go." He didn't say that in a nice, calming, he didn't say like a so-called white man. Or he didn't come up to him and, he made his voice real soft and put his head down. Can you please let my people? He didn't say it like that. He kind of said it in a hostile, austere way. And that was the, that was the religion or the way that we followed back then. So reading on to the next paragraph, it says, when the lepers were attacked, Osarphius sent messengers abroad to conscript a militia. He approached the Hyksos in Jerusalem, and they arrived in thousands from Canaan to help Osarphius, the lepers, at which point Osarphius changed his name to Moses. Now we know he never changed his name to Moses, but again, this Osarphius would be Moses, who we are reading about, that you read about in the Bible. Again, they got their own spin on it. Nevertheless, that's why you got to, again, chew the meat, spit out the bones. It says, together the lepers and the Jerusalemites formed a military power that took over Egypt, looted the Egyptian temples, profaned the idols, and slaughtered and ate sacrificed animals, or sacred animals, Salakia. And that's big because, again, I'm gonna read that point again. It says, together the lepers and the Jerusalemites formed a military power that took over Egypt. Now, who took over Egypt during the plagues? All right, Israel did. The Most High did. He sent the 10 plagues. He sent the blood. He sent the frogs. He sent the flies. He sent the boils. Etc. He sent the darkness, the death of the firstborn. Or he sent the lice. He sent these different things. All right, the hail mingled with the fire. So when it says they took over Egypt, it's talking about the Israelites, the quote unquote lepers, right? Quote unquote Jerusalemites, And it said what? They looted the Egyptian temples. Now I want to get this quick precept. Let's go to Exodus chapter 15. It said they looted the Egyptian temples. Actually, let's go to Exodus chapter. Let me see what I want real quick. Where it said they spoiled, right, the Egyptians. Right, let me find this quick precept. Salakia. Let's go to Exodus 12 and verse 36. All right, Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 36. It says, and the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, meaning the Most High, he gave us, Israel, favor over Egypt, so that they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. You can point it up in another translation. All right, it said they spoiled the Egyptians. Let's see what it said in another translation. All right, see that? They stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. So we kind of just took it. All right, we didn't ask for nothing. We didn't say, can I see that? We didn't put our hands out like this. We kind of went up there. You know how Jake got that spear. Now they snatching chains. Kind of went up to him, snatched his chain, probably hit him a couple times. Hey, we was really getting down with this thing. You gotta put your mind so you overthrowing your enemy. The same slave master that just beat you on your back, Most High set you over him, all that gold and all those jewels. And they say Egypt, Ethiopia, and all these different places in the land of him, they got a lot of gold and wealth, and we're gonna go into it too, but Lord willing. But a lot of these nations, or namely Egypt had a lot of other nations and slavery along with along with Israel. So they had a lot of wealth, a lot of gold that they was just stacking up. We looted and we took all that, and that's the match. You said what?
I got precept.
Con, you got it.
Con, hey, saying robbing the Egyptians, man.
Right.
Out there just utterly robbing them, taking what they want. All right, I keep spelling Ezekiel wrong. Ezekiel 39 and 10. This has to come back again. This is Ezekiel 39 and 10. All right. And it says they won't need to, this is the NLT, they won't need to cut wood from the fields or forests, for these weapons will give them all the fuel they need. They will plunder those who plan to plunder them, and they will rob those who plan to rob them, says the sovereign Lord, or the Lord of hosts, man. So we're going to be robbing the Egyptians all over again. You think you were Egyptians, that was the only time you're going to be robbed, man? You think that was the only time that the Israelites was going to take y'all things, and they talk about Egypt? Yeah, that was a long time ago. The Lord's coming back to Egypt again. Right? The Lord's coming back to Egypt again. Let me go to Isaiah chapter 19 and verse number 1. The Lord is going to come back to Egypt again. And guess what? The Egyptians will be robbed all over again. It says, Isaiah 19:1, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud and shall come into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Right? And this is talking about America when you go into it. So the Lord's going to come back into Egypt again, and you have these Americans that stacked up what? Hey, hold on, let me see something. Right? How much money did America make from slavery? Let's see. They say around 600 million, but it was in the trillions. It was in the trillions, right? It was in the trillions, man. See, they don't want to put it out there. But we're not going to dive too deep into it. But just know that we're going to be robbing you Egyptians, man, of all that free money that our people made, man. All over again. Let me get one more. Zechariah chapter 14. So this is coming back. Right? This is Zechariah 14 and verse 2. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the house is rifled. That's the same spirit of what the brothers bringing out Exodus chapter 12. Is stripping them of their wealth, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the resident people shall be cut off from the city. But you got it, King. I just want to bring those points out that these Egyptians will be robbed again. They will be robbed all over again and stripped of their wealth. But you got it, God.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's plain. We can actually go back to the article. We can go back to the article. It says, let's see where we left off at. I'm gonna read the top part again. It says, when the lepers were attacked, Osphorus went or sent messengers abroad to conscript a militia. He approached the high schools in Jerusalem, and they arrived in thousands from Canaan to help the Osphorus. You know, that never happened. You know, there's no account of that in the Bible.
Right.
It says, and the lepers, at which point Osphorus changed his name to Moses. It was always Moses. Read Exodus, the second chapter. He never changed it. It says, together the lepers and the Jerusalemites formed a military power and took over Egypt, looted the Egyptian temples, profaned the idols. And that's according to the law. Throw down the idols, burn the idols. Read Deuteronomy 7. It says, and slaughtered and ate sacred animals. That's going back to Passover. That same night when we left, right? What do? We slaughtered and we ate the lamb. All right, that sacred animal. We know a lamb in Hebrew culture, in our culture, as a sacred animal. It represents loneliness. It represents our Lord Yahushua. All right, we eat it for the Passover to remember Yahushua, and also to remember the blood that it covered when the death angel passed over Egypt. It says, Apionius fled Egypt and went to Ethiopia. Years later, Apionius left Ethiopia with a huge army and returned to Egypt together with his now grown-up son Ramses. He fought the joint forces of the lepers and the Jerusalemites and pursued them into Syrian mountains. And we know that, again, that's something that they kind of added in there. All right, they pursued us only to the Red Sea, where they were consumed. All right, and from that point on, they never rose up again like that in power. They never had another mighty dynasty like they had during that time. Let me see if it's more on that. It says, I believe that's it on that. All right, that's all I had on that one specifically. Now you can go to the Wikipedia article and pull up the Egyptian and pull up the kings. You may have to scroll down.
Right here.
Yeah, you may have to scroll down. This should list the king. Yeah, kings of the 19th dynasty. All right, so like the brother was going into, this is what you call the 19th dynasty. Now, Egypt, they have many dynasties. When you go into Egypt, they have a lot of history dating further and further and further back to, the Bronze Age, and, things like that, the early Bronze Age and those type of time periods. Now, you got to keep in mind, too, Israel is the newest nation ever formed or created. You have many empires many dynasties, many rulers, many kingdoms, way before we was even a people. You read about the Hittite Empire, or you read about the Sumerians, you read about the Egyptians. Before Israel was even a people, these other nations, they was already getting the ball rolling, with these empires. So when you read about the 19th dynasty, you read about Ramses, Sidi, Ramses the second. All right, how you say that name? Menro, right? Menro from Tat. All right, Sidi the second, etc. These are the kings that you read about in the 19th dynasty. Now, the thing is, scholars, what they do is, like how Zabala brought out earlier, the dates not all the time is going to be 100% accurate. They may be a couple years off, they may be a few years off. Because no scholar during this time actually lived, during that time. And the date system, how they set up the dates, it wasn't like how it was in the elder world or in the ancient world. All right, how they count the dates and they count the years is different. So you gotta kind of gotta line up the dates, right? Approximate with certain time periods, you gotta kind of put it together. So they say Moses lived during the time of either Ramses the second, right, or they say or in the next ruler, Menro Fatat. All right, Menro Fatat. They say during this time period is where the time Moses lived. Now most scholars say Ramses the second. All right, let's go to Exodus chapter 1. Let's go to Exodus chapter 1. And the reason why they say Ramses the second, no ruler besides Ramses the first. It was no ruler named Ramses prior to that time. Again, besides Ramses the first, but Ramses the second, he was also known as Ramses the Great. He was kind of the greatest emperor or the greatest pharaoh during that time. So this Exodus chapter 1 and let's read verse 11. All right, verse 11. And it says, right, it says, therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. And that word Ramses, again, they got that from the name of the Pharaoh. So before that, and also that Ramses is Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. All right, he was one of the greatest pharaohs that Egypt has had. So during this time when they had us in captivity and slavery, we know that they called their lands after their own names, after their own names, paraphrasing. So when you see words like Pithom and Ramses, these are names of kings, and that indicates where Moses could have ruled or Moses could have lived around that time. Now I had an article pulled up on Ramses, I believe.
You can pull it up.
Yeah. All right, let's pull that up real quick.
Stop scaring my screen for 2 seconds.
Right.
You said
you said what?
It's on Ramses, you said?
It's actually the other Wikipedia. I'm gonna send it to you. I don't know if you got that one up. I'm gonna send it to you real quick. All right, and while you're pulling this up, I got this book right here. Right. Got this book right here, the Oxford. I don't know if you can see that. Right, the Oxford Bible Atlas, their third edition. Right, page. I'm gonna pull this up real quick while you going into it. I believe it's page 54. And I ain't gonna lie, this is a good book right here to go into. They got a lot of history, got a lot of scholarship. Page 55. Right. So this book, it got a lot of maps, got a lot of historical references and things to look into, a lot of scholarship. So on page 55, right, it says, let me see where I want to start. All right, it says, it seems likely that Ramses the second, and they say Ramses the second, in this book it says he reigned from 1290 to 1224 BC. Now again, you look it up, you go into certain other scholars, they say different, but it's all around roughly the same time period. So it says he ruled during that 19th dynasty, right? It says, and was the pharaoh of the operation succeeded by Marinta, right? Or Marintafa, and one of whose inscription occurs the earliest non-biblical allusion to Israel. So he's one of the kings that actually mentioned or that took place in Israel, as they say. Now you read about this king, you can scroll down to let me see, scroll down a little bit. It should be a time period of the Egyptians.
Right here.
I'm looking right now. Go to historical pharaohs.
Historical pharaohs.
Yeah, you see on the left side of the screen. Yeah. I believe that's what I want. Scroll down a little bit more. It should list
What is your references?
Salakia. Right. It should be like a timeline of kings. What is going into a list different time periods Moses was kind of mentioned. You can go to unnamed pharaohs. That's probably what it is.
Where you see that?
Actually, you already at the top.
Oh,
On the left side, on your left side of the screen, right under the book of Exodus, and it should start listing certain pharaohs.
right here. Hypotheses on identity.
Okay, Khan. Yeah, that's it. Now scroll down. All right. See, they got Ram. Yeah, right there. That's cool. Now, right here, we read in this little area from Amentuel that we just that's the brother or that's the Egyptian that we read in the other article. Amentuel II from 1455, right on down. It says he claimed to have brought tens of thousands of slaves from the Levant to Egypt, which could be an explanation of the existence of the Israelites in Egypt. And these accounts, we read from all these pharaohs, all of them like to say that they took a part in Moses and the Israelites and things like that. Now in this article right here, it says Ramses lived from 1279 to 1213. It says Ramses II or Ramses the Great is the most common figure for the Exodus pharaoh, as Ramses is mentioned in the Bible as a place, right, as a place name. Then they quoted in Genesis 47 and verse 11, Exodus 11 and 1, right, Numbers 33, verse number 3, right? And we go through these different, we go through these pharaohs, like, for example, Ramses the First. It says, Ahmose I identified as Ramses the First, the pharaoh of the Exodus, and controversial arguments about the identity of the Egyptian official Uyah. So from Amen to Amen to Hatoet the second, all the way to Ramses the second, really all the way to Meneter men.
You talking about him right here, Manetta?
Yeah, Moneta. From those men right there, that they say around that time, that's where the Exodus kind of took place. That's where the time you read about Moses and things like that. But namely is Ramses the second. So from there, you can go to the next article with the Hyscos of Ramses, or namely Mentor. You can go to the Mentor article.
I want to pull up something just real quick.
Okay, Con, you got it.
Kind of going from to this man Ahmose right here, Ahmose the First, right? Because we know a little bit right after that. Hold on, let me kind of scroll down a little bit. Right here. Right. I'm touching this person right here. So let me kind of this right here. Let me see if I can zoom in. Con. All right, this is from the book, an excerpt page of Babylon and Timbuktu. Oops. What just happened? There you go. Page 63, Babylon and Timbuktu. Right? And it says, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more mightier than we. right? Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and come to pass when they fall without any war, they join also into our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. And we know that verse in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 11. And it says, much proof points to the fact that the new Pharaoh who ascended the throne was Ahmose the first, or Ahmose I, the first king of the brilliant 18th dynasty, 1580, 1557. And that's what you was talking about, King. Let me see where you at. This king right here from 1550 1525, right? Who reconquered Egypt, Lower Egypt, from the Hyksos, the rulers of the Asiatic or the Semitic origin, right? As the Pharaoh of Exodus, based on heritage, though, right? So when you kind of go back here, hold on, let me see, right? This is the king that reestablished a spirit of nationalism within the Egyptians, and that's kind of the ruler that kind of made it go downhill all the way up, leading up to Ramses II, right? Going into the Exodus. He was the one that started trying to afflict our people. This guy, right? Who he didn't know Joseph. He said, who the hell is Joseph? Right. And that led into the 19th dynasty, which was, we started building those pyramids and things like that. Kind of scroll back out.
I want to make a quick point too. And just because you see the word Pharaoh, that don't mean it's talking about the same Pharaoh throughout the whole,
right.
The whole Bible. We got pharaohs all the way from Exodus, right, all the way to Chronicles, all the way to Jeremiah, so forth and so forth. So these pharaohs from Exodus 1, and there was a pharaoh that knew not Joseph. That's a different pharaoh from when you read down later in the book of Exodus. So just because it say Pharaoh, don't just automatically assume that it's all the same person. Just a quick point I wanted to make on that.
This thing is acting crazy. All right, Con, I'll just do like, can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it, but the word's kind of hard to see.
Yeah, I know, but it's like every
as long
time
as you can read it, but
yeah, that's what the kind. All right, there we go.
Yeah, that's good, right?
All right, it's cool. All right, and it says he restricted them to male genocide was decreed, and gradually the Hebrews were reduced to slavery. So that's the king. This guy right here, Ahmose I, 1550 1525, he's the one that kind of reduced our people to slavery, and throughout all these kings, right? Amenhotep, right? This is the 430 years, right, that you would see our people kind of reduced to that position, right? All the way leading up to Ramses II. And it kind of adds up, right? It kind of adds up through the spirit, right? When you kind of go into the dates of all these kings, right after Joseph, you will see that this guy, these men right here, really this guy was the reason that, this is the guy that the Lord put to death, right? He was the Lord put him in his army to death, but it really started with him. And it tells you that. Now, another point too, right? Well, actually, I will dive into him a little bit more. All right, this is Ahmose I, was king of ancient Egypt, reigned 1539, 15 BC, and founder of the 18th dynasty, who completed the expulsion of the Hyksos Asiatic rulers of Egypt and invaded Israel and reasserted Egypt's hegemony over North Nubia to the south. Right, so he kind of put things back in order a little bit, and that's when he started. Because remember, they considered our people Hyksos people or Asiatic or Semitic, and that's when they started trying to afflict our people. Resuming the war of liberation against was early in his reign. Ahmose crushed foreigners' allies in Middle Egypt and advancing down the Nile River, capturing Memphis, the traditional capital of Egypt near present-day Cairo. Right, kind of goes into his background a little bit. I'm kind of scroll down. Let me see. Scroll down a little bit.
And also too, third point as well. Remember we was in Egypt for 400 years, or 400 plus years. So throughout all that time period, it's a lot of things that's not written up in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Things didn't start getting written down until Moses came on the scene, which was around the ending of the 400 plus years that we was in Egypt. So all this history is literally history going into from Joseph, right? From when you read Genesis chapter 50 all the way, really, a little even before that, from Genesis around the 50th chapter, 47, 48th, 50th chapter, all the way to the end of Exodus, Exodus 15, Exodus 14, 12. There's all that time period in between it that's not being written of, you know. So kind.
Con. Yeah, I mean that's that time period. That's why we gotta show our scholarship, man. That's why the Bible teaches history, because if for you to understand the Bible, you have to go into history. You have to go into different words. You have to go into the Greek. You have to go into the Latin. You have to go into the Hebrew. You have to understand chronology, the study of time. You have to know these things. That's why the Bible used to be taught in school. How can you not teach this in school right now? How can you not use the scriptures to be taught in school? It links up with directly with the history, right? This is the guy with the famous words. What? Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also to our enemies. Now this verse makes so much sense. King, why would our people want to join to their enemies? Because who was this guy's enemies? Who was this guy's enemies? Let me go back to it. It was the Hyksos people, or the people of the Shemitic origin. Aren't we Shemitic people? Right? Wasn't he trying to expel the Shemitic people? Right? Wasn't he trying to expel them? So wouldn't it make sense that he would say, hold on, these slaves, there's a lot more than them than us, and they are in Egypt right now. They may do a sedition and link up what the Palestinians trying to do right now.
All right.
You know what I'm saying? It's a lot of them here. And they allies with those people over there in Palestine, getting bombed by the Israelis. So they were like, you know what? These Hebrews, they can link up with these other Shemitic people, and they can overthrow Egypt. We got to put them to slavery. So that's why when he says this, now it's not why would we join up with their enemies? We don't even know because their enemies are of the same Shemitic origin of us, and they're Hamites. And
I was gonna say I had a quick point too. And remember, they have around this time they have other nations in captivity too.
Right.
So if they come in and help these nations just overthrow Egypt, then that messes up Egypt. And on top of that, Egypt is the top ruling, place at this time. You even had the Hittite Empire that was kind of equal with Egypt when it came to, resources and power. They was also up there. So Egypt, they trying to make sure they got everyone in subjection so they can stop that, which is why when they seen us increasing, they tried to make sure that they put that to stop speedily, And also to make a quick point on here too, that's how you know it's talking about Israelites, because it says of Semitic origin. And the only people, now we know it's a lot of nations that come out of Shem, but they only classify the Israelites, I'm gonna say Israelites, or the Judean people of Semitic origin. They're not classifying Moab as Semitic. They don't know. They're not classifying, Ishmael as Semitic, even though they are Semitic. But we know when they say Semitic, they're really talking about the Israelites. So that's all I had.
That's right. That's right. And since they were at war, since this king was at war with a lot of the Hyksos, or the Asiatic people, or Shemitic origin, that brings back the point. He thought we were going to link up with them, especially if we was increasing as a nation. And like the brother said, we had more. There was more slaves. There was more slaves than just Israelites in Egypt, where Israelites were the only slave. No, like in Babylon the Great, it's not just Israel. That's in captivity to them. That's here in Babylon the Great. You have a lot of the other nations here in servitude to Esau as well. So when you go into Egypt, you had who else? I'm kind of scrolling. There we go. And it says, during the period that the Hebrews were slaves for Pharaoh, they built many of the megalithic scriptures. The Hebrews erected some pyramids. They dug great many channels for the river. They built walls for the cities and ramparts. It's the same thing we do in Babylon. They constructed the halls at Karnak for Thutmose I. They built temple pylons, Hispado halls, and obelisks for Amenhotep III. By the edict of Ramses II, they constructed at these the temple of Ramusium with its colossal statues of himself. Ramusium museum. That's where you get that word. And they built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. And that's what we read in Exodus 1 and 13. But look, naturally, the Hebrews were not the only slaves in Egypt. They were Ethiopian slaves. So yes, slaves of Ethiopians were there. Nubians, Canaanites, right? Syrians, right? That's what those are Asiatic people, other Asiatics, right? Ishmaelites and things like that. And people from the Aegean Islands, right? You got sons of Japheth in there too. But the Hebrew slaves were in the majority. So that's why he was leading. That's why he was like, hold on, these Hebrews, I know we got other slaves, but these Hebrews, man, and we fighting with them Ishmaelites and them other Asiatic people. Nah, we can't go. We got to put these people into slavery. So it makes and it makes that our deliverance that much more special. I also wanted to make a point on that too. The Lord didn't kill everybody's firstborn for just anybody. He did it for us. The Lord didn't save the Nubians. The Lord didn't care about the Canaanites or the Syrians or the Ethiopians or them sons of Japheth. The Lord only cared about our people. I'm gonna get one precept on that, King, real quick. So I just kind of want to make that point. All right, this is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18. I'm gonna start at verse 1. I'm gonna start at verse. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18, and I start at verse 3. Instead, whereof thou gavest them a burning pillar of fire, both to be a guide of the unknown journey and a harmless son to entertain them honorably, talking about what the Lord did for us. And it says, for they were worthy to be deprived of light and imprisoned in darkness, who have kept thy sons shut up. Thy sons, these Egyptians kept us shut up. He's not talking about them Canaanites. He's not talking about them Ethiopians. Right, by whom the uncorrupt light of the law was to be given unto the world. Who is that world the law was given unto? The world is Israel. And when they had determined to slay the babes of the saints, one child being cast forth and saved to reprove them, thou tookest away the multitude of their children and destroyest them altogether in a mighty water, man. So the Lord, he did that only for the children of Israel. Yeah, you had more slaves there, but the Lord only saved us out of Egypt. So how does the Lord love everybody? But you got it.
You can go to Exodus, right? Chapter 12 and verse number 38 to let me back off that point that you made. And before I read it, I want to make a point that I said earlier about it being multiple nations that was enslaved in Egypt. That's why when the Midianites came and took Joseph, the first thing they thought was, let's give him to Egypt as a slave. Because Egypt, at that time, they were already known for having slaves. I'm not just going to sell a slave to a random person. No, the Midianites, when they stole and they captured Joseph, the first thing on their mind was, okay, well, let's make some money. Let's give them to the Egyptians. Because the Egyptians, they already had slaves on top of that. And again, Israel being the last nation created, established, we was the last nation that was put in slavery under them once we multiplied within that landmass, showing you that it was already slaves there before that. But this is Exodus chapter 12 and verse number 38. It says, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. So that mixed multitude, that's not talking about the Egyptians and the Israelites. How do we know that? Because the Lord, he destroyed the Egyptians. The Egyptians can't walk out with us if the Most High just destroyed them. He killed their cattle. He killed all their firstborn. All right, they're not going to walk out with the same nation that just destroyed them. That mixed multitude is the other slaves that was written of in the book Babylon and Temple 2. Those are the other slaves that seen that we was getting our deliverance and tried to get in there with us and kind of sneak out with us.
Was it the Egyptians?
Yeah, it wasn't Egypt. A lot of people, a lot of Christians, they read that and say, see, well, God is dealing with the mixed multitude, and Egypt, they kind of got out of there too. How did Egypt get out of there and the Most High just killed them? He said smote them with boils. They was getting, frogs in their food, and it was getting all type of lice in their hair. All right, the cattle getting destroyed. Your firstborn son literally just died. Now you want to walk out with the same people that was, that took part in that. So the mixed multitude, it actually wasn't Egyptians and Israelites. It was other captive slaves that the Egyptians had in subjection. All right, let's read about this mixed multitude. It says, naturally, the Hebrews were not the only slaves in Egypt. There were Ethiopian slaves Nubians, all right, mixed multitude, Canaanites, Syrians, and the people from the Aegean islands, like the brother said, Japheth, all those people. It says, but the Hebrew slaves were a majority. Why? Because in Exodus 1, we increased exceedingly. Now I want to jump to Numbers chapter 11 and verse 4. So now that we got the understanding of who the mixed multitude is, that makes it, again, like how the article said, that's what make it that much more mighty, because the Most High, he didn't save everyone. Again, a lot of Christians, they say, well, God, he delivered everyone out of Egypt, all right, Israel and the Egyptians. Well, let's see what the Lord said. This Numbers chapter 11. You go to chapter 11 and verse 4.
Con.
All right, this Numbers chapter 11 and verse number 4. It says, and the mixed multitude that was among them, right, that we just read about in Exodus 12 and 38, it says, fell a lusting. And the children of Israel wept again and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? So that mixed multitude that actually went up with us, because again, Christians have used that and try to say God loves everyone somehow, some way. I don't know how, but they try to insert that. That same mixed multitude, the Most High had them falling away. All right, the Most High, he cast away the mixed multitude and they fell a lusting. All right, they couldn't endure the wilderness. They couldn't endure, that journey with us. So they kind of parted ways. And again, now that's more proof that it was other nations, because as we left out, the Most High, he gave us our own journey to go through. All right, kind of went down the little crescent. We came back up, went through Moab, tried to go through Edom. They didn't let us go through. We went through all that process, right? But these other nations, they kind of went back to their landmass. They said, okay, well, I'm gonna stop right here. Land of Canaan is right here. I'm gonna take this way. Syrians said, okay, I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna go this way. Every nation, they fell a lust and went their own way. But Israel, right, we kind of stayed on that path that the Most High kind of guided us through. All right, with the chariot, the cloud, the fire by night and the light by day, things like that. So, that's all I had on that, just to let me back off that book.
Con. Let me pull this up real quick too. Hold on. All right, so this guy Meneptah, right after Ramses II, right after he's the ruler that ruled right after Ramses II, and you have something called the Meneptah Stele. All right, hold on, I'm kind of bring this over here. Right, so you have something called the Meneptah Stele, and it kind of goes back to this guy here. Hold on. Where you at? There we go. Right, this guy right here, Meneptah. And he had a lot of campaigns or a lot of military engagements kind of during the 18th dynasty as well. And it says he was the 13th son of Ramses II, only come to power because all his older brothers had died, including his full brother Ahmose I and his father. He was around 70 years old when he ascended to the throne. He is arguably best known for the Meneptah Stele, featuring the first known mention of the name Israel, right? Of the name Israel. So the Meneptah Stele is biblical proof or actual archaeological proof, if you didn't know, that documents Israel in history over 3,700 years ago, right? And it says the Meneptah was the 13th son of Ramses, although life was overshadowed by his father. Many Egyptologists suggest that Meneptah was both a co-ruler and a real power behind the throne in the last few years of Ramses' life. Right, his military campaigns are recorded on 3 separate ancient inscriptions, with the victory stele of Meneptah as one of them, with 25 readable lines written in hieroglyphics. The inscriptions recounts Meneptah's conquest of the land of Canaan. Right, his conquest of the land of Canaan. Part of the inscription reads, right, Canaan is captive with all woe. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer, conquered. Yanam made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, bare of seed. Israel then must have been a people strong enough for Meneptah to mention them in boasting of his victory. Of course we did. We had the Most High God, but when we transgress, that's what happens. It says if Israel was some small nomadic tribe just beginning to settle in Canaan, Meneptah wouldn't have anything to boast about. Or alternatively, if Israel had been established for 200 years, built its own structures and had a stronger military, then his victory would be worth mentioning. So when you go into the Meneptah stele, let me see. I just had it. Oh, here. Oh, yeah. When you go to the Meneptah stele, this is an actual archaeological fact that scholars found to kind of prove Israel's existence, man. All right. So this is what it is right here. And that goes back to the son of Ramses II.
And also, too, when you read it, it said all his older brothers died.
Mm-hmm.
That showed that the Most High kind of killed the firstborn.
Yep.
So.
Hey, all them died, dead. Most High took them out. Right. Took him out of here, man. And his father. Israel is wasted, its seed is not. You see that? So this is proof that we lived during that time, that we was in the land of Israel. How we was and it makes sense and it lines up because we were in the land of Israel. Hold on, let me scroll down. After Ramses II, because we journeyed into Israel, and then next he ruled. So it kind of lines up with the dates and biblically just kind of understanding that. Let me kind of pull this up. Rand. Did you have another article you want to go into?
I was gonna see if you can pull up. Well, we can probably do it later, but I was gonna go into different artifacts in Egypt or different archaeology in Egypt showing how we was there, like how you got the chariot wheels in the Red Sea still to this day.
You sent it to me?
No, that's what I was looking for, but you can go through it. I'm gonna send it to you though. You got the Mount Sinai. How they say it's a part over there at Mount Sinai where the top of the mountain is burnt. Or you can go back to that, and I believe that's Exodus the 19th chapter where the Most High he set fire and thunder on top of Mount Sinai when Moses went up, to get the oracles of the Most High God. You got the rock that was split when Moses smote the rock twice and water came out. You still have these different so what I'm looking for. Still got these different archaeological evidence things that's still over there in Israel and in Egypt in that area, showing how the things in the Bible actually match up with the evidence that's over there to this day. The Most High kind of preserved it for our faith in these last days,
Calm.
But you can go through the article. I'm gonna look at it while you.
Calm. So this kind of, and it's very vague, like he was going into. It just proves that Ramses II was indeed the Pharaoh that lived during the time of Moses, right? And it says, let me kind of scroll down. It's not really too much on this. Let me see. See where I want to start at. So what they did was they examined this corpse. This corpse is Ramses II, right? The Egyptians, they preserved their mummies, right? They preserved their mummies by doing, ointments and different things that they will give their mummies, and they'll bury them with gold, and they'll stuff them, and all of that, right? So they pulled up Ramses II. Right, let me see. All right, let me start right here. The veteran Egyptian archaeologist Hawass also explained that each royal mummy will be displayed with all its personal belongings and evidence or data about the profession of the owner of the mummy, and the results of DNA tests and CT scans, which determine the cause of death. According to Hawass, Ramses V was sick with smallpox. From the aforementioned, we can deduce it was either evident whether CT scans proved the cause of death. Did Ramses II die of drowning? As theoreticians claim him to be the Pharaoh of Moses, it is not possible CT scans to know whether the mummy died of drowning or not. The only thing that proves it, which is the lung, which is not found inside the mummy. When they took the mummy of Ramses II in the 80s to prove that he was the Pharaoh of Moses, one of the researchers stole the hair of his restoration trip in France, putting it in a safe in his house. When the restorer passed away, his son tried to sell the hair.
That's off.
Yes,
That's off.
I can tell he was an Edomite. He has to be.
Yeah, I'm
But
not.
what
I'm
he
not
doing?
dead mummy's hair and collecting it and selling it.
Yeah, that's weird. That's off. There was a point I wanted in here. I don't know if I can. Uh, It's cool. There was a point I wanted there to kind of show that, but let me see. Pull up something else real quick. Let me see. I must have been up there already. Okay, Con, we done. We can get into this one.
Okay, Con. Yeah. So this man, main Theo now. When you look at the list that the brother had pulled up not too long ago, talking about the different Egyptian pharaohs, and it was sorting different sizes. This man Matthew, he was one of the sources that was pulled up. Now it says he was a Greco, right? Similar to Josephus, how Josephus he was a Roman, right? A Judean Roman historian. Every nation has their own historians. So this man, he was an Egyptian that was under the Greek influence, and he was a quote unquote scholar and a quote unquote priest. It says Matthew, a native of the 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 Siboney, right, the Sibonitos, right? Egypt served as a priest in Heliopolis. Thoroughly versed in Egyptian lore, he was also associated with the religious policy of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So he lived during the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty. All right, says in particular with introduction of the cult of Serpis. Matthew was the first Egyptian to give an account of the history of his country in Greek. A number of fragments from the work are preserved in a Contra Apomenia of Josephus, who apparently did not draw from Matheno's work at the first, but from extracts of Hellenistic Judean historians. The fragments fall into two categories, the first of which describes the origin of the rule of the Hyksos. Now, we touched on it earlier. It's just, going back over it. It shows more proof that these people at the Hyksos was a well-known people during the time. Now, again, it's not going to say Israelites. It's not going to say, again, God's chosen people. It says the Hyksos in Egypt. Then it kind of lists Josephus and the source. It says Matthew, in accordance with later Egyptian accounts, writes that the Hyksos were a nation, alien conquerors, who set fire to Egyptian towns.
See
All right,
that?
did the Most High literally send fire on a physical level when he rained hail and fire on the whole land of Egypt? So, and honestly, you reading this should build your faith up like, man, it's okay, this Bible really is real. All right, and that's why it's important for you to know these things because someone may come up and they may say, all right, well, show me without, they may say, and they say this at camp all the time. All right, prove to me that Bible is real, but don't go to the Bible. Some people they just not gonna believe in the Bible, so you gotta go through, you gotta go through different sources, gotta quote certain men of old. You have to pull up Alexander the Great, famous men of old, and link it up with the precepts. So these articles in this history, someone may say that, and you may say, "Well, you ever heard about the Hyksos people?" They may say no. You may go into it, and these Hyksos people was in Egypt. All right, and they set Egypt on fire. He go into these accounts. You cut them up through the history, all right, through the scholarship. It says, I'm gonna read that again. Matthews writes that the Hyksos were a nation of alien conquerors. Why we call aliens? Because we're not from that land. We're not Egyptians. All right, we're foreigners. That's why Moses said, "I am a stranger in a strange land," and he named his son Gershom. You know, it says, "Who set fire to the Egyptian towns, raised the temples of the gods, and treated the natives with cruelty." Who are the natives? The Egyptians. They were native to that land. It says after the expulsion from Egypt, so they got expelled out of Egypt. It says the Hyksos crossed the desert on their way to Syria. Now you may say that, now you may read that and say, okay, why they go to Syria? thought in the Bible it said, they went to, the land of Canaan. Well, we got to remember he's writing this during the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Syria around that time was that Levant area, and it took over that land of Israel. All right, you read about something called, or you in the book of Daniel and in history, read about the 6 Syrian wars. All right, where the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty was going back and forth, and they tried to take over that land of Israel. It was a big civil war within the Grecian or Greco realm, and they was trying to take over that land, that Syria, Levant land, which was the land of Israel. So when it says they traveled to Syria, what he's saying is they really traveled to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. All right, and that's that history again, going into it, backing it up with the Bible, going throughout the law, where Moses is traveling, Joshua traveling, leading us into the promised land and these different things. It says, in a country called Judea built a town, which they named Jerusalem. See that? Which they named Jerusalem. All right. It says, and that's how you know that these high schools people are Israelites. All right, what other nation traveled to Syria, named it Jerusalem? All right, where's that kind of the Chinese man doing that? Where's that kind of the so-called white man traveling and setting up Jerusalem? All right, it's not in there. Reading on, it says, although Matthews does not mention the Judean people by name, and that's the point. Just because it don't say God's chosen people, Israelites, just because it don't mention them by name, it says he is clearly referring to them. Because some people will say, well, that's your interpretation. All right, that Edomite, he said that yesterday. He said, see, black people, y'all came out of slavery and y'all just want a religion to follow. All right, so why is this man coming out and saying that these people, and we all know during the time in Egypt, during this time, it was all dark-skinned people. All right, there was no Edomites that was just, conquering. If it was Esau, they would have called them Greeks. They would have called them Edomites. They would have kind of put on their walls non-pigmented people. Even though it was Egypt, is dark-skinned people. All right. So again, it's just all pointing back to how these are Israelites, and we can go into the history, Jews being so-called black people, etc., etc., etc. But I believe that's all I had on. I'm gonna read that last part. It says, although Matthews does not mention the Jews by name, he clearly is referring to them. Josephus himself distinguishes between the first group of fragments of Matthew's writings and the second. And again, Josephus, he also got a lot of good points, I believe, on these different topics when it comes to Egypt and Joseph and Abraham, how he dealt with the Egyptians and things like that. And Josephus, he was also a Jake. He was a Levite. So that's some good history. Going to.
Definitely. Yeah, this is mighty to kind of understand as well. As the brother said, shooting me, spit out the bones on certain these articles. But this, kind of exemplifying our people being there, and proving that history. You know what I'm saying? Let me kind of go back to this real quick. I'm gonna get a precept. All right. What is 2 Timothy? Right, it's 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 15. Right? Study to show thyself approved unto Yahweh, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So you have to, you got to go into these things as we brought out at the beginning of the video. Studying to show yourself approved unto the Most High. This is a work. You got to work. You got to dive into it. You got to pull up different articles. You got to kind of scrub through the articles, make sure they're valid, and make sure this linked up with this precept and these articles. You're going to get the dates in order. It's not easy. A lot of people couldn't even do this in school, but now we're doing it for the Lord. We're doing it for the Lord now. We're doing it for our history. We used to do this for Esau's history. I used to do this for, the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, right? Pieties, all of these Plates, right? Whatever these scholars, we used to do these things for Esau. But now we got to be a workman that needed not to be ashamed. Why? Because it's your forefathers, man. It's the history of your fathers. You want to know what's going on. You know, you want to have that understanding of what's going on, man. You go to Sirach 7 and 15. There you got it. Slocky. Actually, let me get this. All right. It's not giving it. Got it. You go to Ecclesiastes chapter 39, verse 1. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 39 and verse 1. But he that giveth his mind to the law of the Most High and is occupied in the meditation thereof will seek out the wisdom of all the ancient and be occupied in prophecies. He will keep the sayings of renowned men, and where subtle parables are, he will be there also. He will seek out the sentences of the secrets of grave sentences and be conversant in dark parables, man. So this is what we do. This is what we do. And this is what our love is at, man. It's by seeking out the wisdom of all the ancient, man. Right? Looking at the secrets, right? Understand now certain verses in the Bible take a different toll just because now we know the history behind it. You know, but you got it.
You can go to Proverbs 25 and verse number 2. Proverbs chapter 25 and verse number 2. It says, the glory of God is to conceal a thing. And that's why the Most High had all this knowledge, all this understanding. He concealed it until the times of the end, right? It says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. And that's the whole point of going over this lesson, is to search out these matters, these different histories that the average man probably doesn't know. Again, we read earlier, 1 Chronicles 25 and 8, that the Most High called his teachers and scholars. This is scholarship. You know, and every man should strive to get into that scholarship, because you're not doing it for yourself, but you're doing it for the betterment of the nation, for your people. All right, this thing is about the nation of Israel as a whole. You know, so when you find these things out, you should want to put it forth so the rest of your people can know. There's a lot of demons in the last days, a lot of scoffers, it's a lot of men falling out the truth, which is why we need these weapons, the scholarship, the Bible, the precepts, the Holy Spirit. You need these things to overcome all the wickedness on the left-hand side that's trying to overthrow this truth, you know, within the spiritual realm of things that you don't see, you know. And I got another quick precept. Let's go to Daniel 7 and verse 25. All right, let's go to Daniel. Let me see if that's what I want. Daniel 7 and verse 25. No, that's not what I want. What's it? Knowledge shall be increased. Is that Daniel chapter 12?
Yeah, it's Daniel 12.
Yeah, let's go to Daniel chapter 12. That verse 2. Daniel chapter 12.
Verse 4.
All right. Verse 4. Daniel chapter 12 and verse number 4. It says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book. The time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And the Most High is going to reveal and increase more and more knowledge in the last days. All right, the Most High is not going to have these things shut up forever, which is why we're able to go into this thing. And now you see yourself all the way back during the time of Exodus, not just in the precepts. And that shows that these other nations, they know who you are too. All right, the real Egyptians, not those Ishmaelites over there, but the real Egyptians, all right, they know that they had you in slavery. All these Africans, they know that you God's chosen people, that y'all not the same people, that they oppressed you at one point in time, you know. So the Most High said, knowledge shall be increased. These are things, again, that we never learned in school. How that the so-called Egyptians during the time of the Exodus had our fathers in slavery, but now in the last days, the Most High has revealed that unto us. I got one more precept. Let's go to Colossians, the first chapter. All right, was that 1 and 26? All right, Colossians chapter 1 and verse number 26. It says, even the mysteries which have been hid from ages and generations, but now is made manifest to his saints. So this knowledge that was made, a stumbling block, it was hid up. The Lord said he made it manifest to the saints. And again, this thing was hid up for generations, millenniums, decades. I'm led to believe the things that we just went over. My grandfather don't know about this. All right, your great auntie, your uncles, they don't know about this. But the Most High, he has manifested it to his saints in the last days. And if they have things like this, on the internet for you to search up, how much more things that's hid up that Esau still has, covered up through the Spirit. So that's why it's important for you to search these things out through the grace and mercy of the Most High. Like, that's all I got.
That's right. And Lord willing, like I said, every week we can kind of continue going into these different things, going into these different topics. But hey, you should already know these things, man. You should already be getting into these topics, man. Get into these different topics, the different histories, the different slaveries that our people were in. But Lord willing, we can continue to edify the nation in the best way we can, right? And with that, I would like to give all praise to Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua, his brothers Abiyallah,
Brother Marquas.
right? And we bid Israel a mighty strong shalom.
Shalom.